Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Technology Evangelist Podcast. I'm Dr. John Fluke, Technology Evangelist, and I'm grateful to Medidenta for helping sponsor this. Today, we're going to have a great conversation with a guy that I know, but I don't know very well. So hopefully at the end of this, we'll all know him better. Really great individual. He teaches at the Pankey Institute, Dr. Charlie Wahl. Charlie, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. We were briefly talking a little bit how I got started
Yeah, give
in
me your
life, in
origin story.
dentistry, those kind of
Yeah,
things. And
please.
um, so I grew up on the island of Guam, out in the Pacific, and everybody assumes that military brat, those kind of things. And my
Yeah,
dad
yeah.
actually moved from the Midwest as a teacher in 1960, and so I was kind of born out there, graduated high school, but through my growing up, a good friend of mine, his dad was my dentist. And I remember, his dad was always, very hands-on, was an engineer prior to dentistry and, created plenty of Halloween dentures for him, kind of the original Billy Bob, I call it.
Yeah, I
Um,
remember those.
and, you know, being on an island, you have to find things to do. So I got into motocross racing, which being close to Japan was pretty interesting because we had a lot of their riders that would come and train and practice there. And so, the skill level was pretty good. Not that I was maybe that good, but I had fun doing it. And one of the dentists in this practice, actually, we would go to his lab and use the equipment to polish carburetor ports and do all these things to try to improve, efficiency of the parts that we had. And so that probably got my first interest into dentistry. Just kind of hanging out in the dental lab and, learning cool things to do, totally unrelated to dentistry, but I like the toys and tools that they had. And so, went to college to be a PE teacher and, got excited about some of the science courses and, got a little bit sidetracked. I had a choice to student teach or go to dental school. And, here I am, 30 years later. So, that was kind of my segue into the profession. I actually went back to Guam and practiced dentistry there for 4 years, um,
Wow.
which was amazing. We didn't really have a lot of specialists, so I always say it was a well-paid residency program. We you kind of just got fully engrossed. The population needed a lot of dentistry. Um, I worked in a group practice, and so we kind of did everything and probably some things better than others, especially right out of school. You leave school thinking you know it all, and you get in private practice and realize, holy cow, I really have no clue.
Yeah.
um, but from a technology standpoint, I've always been interested in everything technology. When I went to college, I was one of two kids in my dorm that had a computer, and so and my mom taught me how to type pretty early, so I was I made a lot of beer money learning how to type papers and had an old dot matrix printer that cranked out a lot of papers for other people. So um, once I got into dentistry, pretty quickly it was you know that era of digital scanners and I skipped the powder side of all of that. And and I think it was 2008 I got an E4D scanner, and that was the
Mhm.
first segue into, hey, how do we learn this, how do we do this in the digital world? And I look back at those scanners. You had a foot pedal that you were stomping on to take images. And thankfully the technology let us think that we were doing some pretty good dentistry. And ultimately I think it was there at the time to kind of really bring it forward. And in today's world, I always say at that start, I always compare it to like dentistry for dummies. It was the segue for dentists to start to get into this whole concept of, wow, I can not only scan something but create something as well. And so that's kind of got me into the lab side, which we now have a full lab in our practice. We transitioned from in-office dentistry to full lab dentistry. We have 3 different lab mills, 3 different printers. We do pretty much everything either in-house, and we also do a lot of dentistry for other dentists as well. So kind of fully engrossed in 3Shape, segueing, doing some transition into exocad as well, trying to make sure that we can provide all access, as well as, some software is better than others, depending on what we're doing. So still trying to learn that aspect out. You get ingrained in one technology. It's hard sometimes to spend enough time to learn it to get absolutely proficient in it. So
You
that's the
know,
quick version.
yeah. Well, it's funny, I think, because the people that I've had on there are doctors, because I've had some folks that are in other spheres of what we do, but almost to a person, every one of the doctors that's gotten really good at this stuff, this digital stuff, describes themselves as, oh, well, I started out, I was a tinkerer. And it's funny that you started out with motorcycles, because
Right.
I I started out, and we're in the same age category. I started out with a friend of mine taking cars apart. And when you talked about cleaning the carburetor, I was like, oh, I remember we had one of my friends had a Holly 800 CFM carburetor, and we took it all apart and cleaned it. And that tinkering thing, just once you get that bug, it just grows. So,
Yeah, totally.
yeah, when the computers came in, I mean, I hadn't had a computer in my office probably about 6 months. And one night I was like, I wonder what it looks like inside. I'm like, I know I can put it back together. So I
Yeah,
took it
yeah.
apart, and that kind of started the whole thing. So that tinkering aspect, I think, is huge. And you were talking about like jumping systems too. And I think the only time that I've really used something that was kind of what I would consider by today's standards crude, that helped me with something better was in the old CAD CAM days. I actually had a Cerac 2,
Right,
which
right.
booted with a floppy disk. That's
Yeah, yeah.
for everybody that was, born after 2000. You may know it.
What's a floppy disk? Yeah.
Exactly. But when you designed the restorations, you had three windows that showed the X, Y, and Z
Yeah,
axis.
yeah.
And it was hard to understand. But then when Cone Beam came on the market, I was like, oh my gosh, I know exactly what these windows are, because it's the same doggone thing. But
Definitely.
other than other than that, I think you're right. Jumping systems is really hard. What design system did you start with?
So we started out with 3Shape.
Okay.
At the time, ExoCAD was out, but it wasn't really at the mainstream. I got into 3Shape at the end of 2015.
Okay.
Um, and even comparing where we are now at the versions, it's significantly different. It looks the same, but the abilities, there were so many workarounds we had to do in the past that you've still got to do some workarounds, but at least now it's kind of picked up pace, and you can kind of tell it, this is what I want to do, and that's what you actually do, versus telling it, we're going to do this, but I'm going to trick you into doing that.
Right.
um
Yeah.
and so everybody has the question, what's better, exocad or 3Shape, and it depends. I think
Uh-huh.
more so now that I'm learning both. Depending on what we're doing, some are better at others, at some
Mhm.
things, and the other software is better than others. And so um that's kind of been, outside of that initial Sirac and E4D/Plan Mecca concept. That was the initial learning, and then transitioning. I remember one of the old labs, had their Sirac in lab where, you were looking at a tooth and it was all just triangles. It wasn't even a real image, and you were manipulating cuss tips and with just lines. And I was like, holy cow, like I love that concept, that tinkering, like you said, brain power was in full effect. But turning that into a real tooth, and even then, they really didn't look very pretty back then.
Yeah.
But you know, so that's kind of where I got started. So I'm still mostly 3Shape, just because I spent so many years doing it. It's just efficient. What I can pull up and do, I can do much quicker. But I'm trying to force myself now to get a little better with other software as well.
Well, and I think what you just said, it's huge, because I don't know this for a fact, but I have a theory that the only time this, at least it applies to me, the only time I really ever learn anything hands-on is when I do it wrong. When I break something, my
That's
grandpa used to say, experience is what you get 5 seconds after you should have had it in the first place. And it's so
a
true.
true statement.
So when you start doing something new, whatever it is, the mistakes are what you learn from. And I think
Right.
it's weird in dentistry because, I mean, for lack of a better description, we perform in front of patients. We have to be confident. We have to be relaxed. We've got to be, this is no big deal. We do this every day. This is simple because people are frightened. And I've seen it a lot of times in doctors where they go to do something new, like even an intraoral scan. And for some reason, the first time it doesn't quite work out. They struggle a little bit. And then they look at their assistant and they say, go get me the impression material. And that's because there's pressure, you need to perform, and that's where your comfort level is.
Right.
But sometimes then people they had that one bad experience and they're like, okay, that's not for me. I'm not going to do it. And they stick with the old. But pushing your comfort zone and knowing, telling a patient ahead of time, this is the first time we've tried to use one of these things. If this doesn't give me, the result that I'm going to expect to deliver to you, then I'm going to go back and do it the old way. But let's try this and see.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of setting yourself up at least so that, there's not all that pressure because, pushing your comfort zone is, what's the old thing about, you take clay and you put it in a kiln and there's heat and it, turns it into something beautiful. Pressure makes diamonds. There's a bunch of it.
Right.
But
yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I always go into something where we're learning something new or implementing something new is like, we already know what plan B is before
yes,
we get there. So this way, like, it's all set up, it's all out. So if there's any struggle in this, if we're taking longer than whatever to do this, like, it's like, okay, great, that part's done. Now we're going to go the next step, So it's that confidence that there's no panic, there's no whatever. It's just like, hey, the assistant's on board, the staff's on board, whatever it is, I'm on board, the patient's on board, that it's just one extra step in the process instead of like, holy cow, like this is the first time, or, because not many
yeah,
people want to hear that, whatever it
yeah,
is, even if it's a reversible thing. It's like, oh, hey,
yeah,
we're going to try this for the first time. And that everybody goes gulp, kind of thing. So,
yeah.
but yeah, no, so troubleshooting is key, right? Like, and I agree, like the best way to learn is by making mistakes. My son turns 21 tomorrow and
Congratulations.
I'm like, hey, you're getting to the age where mistakes start to matter more, so hopefully those mistakes you've made up to this point, and we know life experience, you're going to make a lot more, but the older you get, those become a little more important. So try to have fun, but don't be that guy either, kind of same thing, so I
I
totally
like
agree.
I like the thing on plan B. I'm gonna throw a shout out to probably the greatest mentor I ever had, Dr. Brett Ferguson, who is now a renowned oral surgeon. But he helped train me, and I wouldn't be where I am today without him. And one time I remember he told me, Fluky, if you plan for an emergency, you cease to have one. And I swear to you, I think of that every day. And I like your plan B because that's just another way to say it. You know already what you're going to do if you hit a snag.
Right,
You
exactly.
know, I mean, and people, I don't think a lot of times people think about it, but like when you're in dentistry, you always have a plan B. You may not realize it, but if you're
Right,
cutting a crown prep and you're taking decay out and it goes into the pulp, okay, plan B is we're going to do endo.
right.
And we don't even think about that. We just roll, we put on the rubber dam, we do the endo. But the plan B thing is huge. And I wanted to make a comment too about your deal with exocad and 3Shape and some of the other design softwares out there. Everybody wants to know which one's the best.
Right.
And what I think is, well, would you like a Range Rover or do you want a Porsche Cayenne? And the thing is, they're similar. They both do a lot of the same things, but one might suit what you need better than the other. So,
Exactly.
and if
Yep.
somebody gave me one of those, I'm certainly not going to, give it back. But it's just, there isn't one best. It kind of
Right,
depends
right.
on a lot of things. So I
Yeah,
think,
it's the user interface, it's
yes.
what you're comfortable with, what you like, what looks the best, do you like the purple blue color or do you like a different reddish color?
Mhm.
They all have factors that drive us to make those choices. And ultimately the end result is pretty much the same thing. It's just how efficiently and comfortable are you with those learning steps and processes.
Yeah, and and like you said, you started with 3Shape in, was it 2015? Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. So they've changed so much. One of the other things that I'm always beating the drum about is that people sometimes look at something, and when you're a dentist with you're in my age group, and we've been doing it a while, so we've seen some things. And like, okay, quick story. First time I saw 3D printing in dentistry, I think it was 14 or 15. It was the last time the ADA was in Washington, D.C.
Right.
Remember, I saw some 3D printers, and I was talking to the companies because it was fascinating to me. And one of the companies, I said, they had, I don't even know what it was, a flipper or something. I said, how do you make that? And they pulled out Blender on their laptop,
Yep.
and if you were one of those people who saw it then, and I'm sure that most people were like, oh my gosh, because if you don't know, Blender is designed for engineers. So it's,
Right.
and if you looked at it then and you said this is too complicated, the interfaces have changed so much. I mean, kind of give me a little bit on that. How much have you seen change in just the way we create things?
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, take Blender for example. They now have Blender for dental, right? They actually have tooth libraries and all these
Yes.
things. So instead of having to just kind of like import a some kind of shape and turn it into a tooth,
Right.
you can now grab a tooth and put it in here. Um, you look at early on Cirac software, the ability to take a tooth and now you can take a whole arch of teeth. Mesh Mixer is another one, very
Yes.
similar, free
Yeah.
software that, its interface, if you're a non-digital or non-dental person and you love digital, you can make so many things in Mesh Mixer, just like Blender, the ability to just take a image of a mouse or whatever, and turn it into something else or section it and cut it and Boolean differences and all those fancy
Yeah.
words that we try to block out because we just need to click a button and get a product. Um, that to now they're a little bit more streamlined, right? They have better uh, button icons and things that tell us, okay, hey, do this next, right? Like the
Right.
AI, even like Exocad, I think their AI is amazing. Um, their ability to kind of guide you through each step is just transformative from an efficiency standpoint, from a learning standpoint. And so I think, it's just like everything, things evolve or they disappear, and so um, I think the market in dentistry is hugely changing in the digital realm, both on the lab side and in the clinic side. And so having the understanding, coming back to our troubleshooting and
Mhm.
tinkering stage, like, hey, how much am I comfortable with now? How much am I comfortable investing time to learn? And how much do I want to? I like the concept, but I want somebody else to do all that for me. Those are kind of our challenges as the clinician to say, hey, I love it. I like the control, but I like my time off too, and so it's a balance. But yeah, no, there's no doubt that the evolution of all of these softwares has made a huge difference.
It the AI part of it, it just blows me away. These intelligent systems with, sometimes you'll look at a design of something, or it'll say, what about this? And you look at it and you're like, oh, that's good. I would have done that, or whatever. Um, it's really amazing to me. And the other thing that you said is that you don't have to be a tinkerer. Um, in the analog world, if you don't have a lab in your office, you take an impression, you send it to the lab does everything for you. Um, with the fabrication systems that are out there now, people don't have to. And I think that's sometimes a misconception too, is I've got to try and do this all myself. And you really don't. You can just send digital things to the lab and have the lab return digital things. I mean, just quickly, because you have a lab that you do work for other dentists, how much of that comes to you digitally versus analog now?
I would say, I mean, one, we're still a dental practice
Right.
with a
Okay.
dental lab, right? So, I mean, we have a group of dentists that we use for our lab, but I thankful and fortunate I can say, hey, this is how we want your cases,
Yes. Yeah, that's
So
great.
I would say 95% of our stuff is transmitted digitally.
Okay.
Sometimes we get a new dentist that we're going to start working with, and they'll still send us some analog stuff that we'll
Mhm.
then have to digitize.
Right.
But very quickly, I'm like, it's just not efficient. One, it takes me more manpower to have lab techs digitize all that stuff,
Right.
and two, hey, there's shipping, there's extra time, there's all those factors that go into saying, hey, there's a better way to do this, and
Mhm.
you scan it at your office, you have an intraoral scanner that can work, and then we'll manage the digital side. So we're probably a little bit different in that regard. That my goal is not to get stuff in the mail. The only thing I want to do is be mailing stuff out for
Right.
final restorations or prosthetics. So pretty quickly when we do get stuff sent in analog, we try to reverse that process. So I would say if we looked at the whole lab group, I would say most labs though, probably they still get a decent amount in the analog world, a minimum of 30%, if not more, but I think all labs would love to just have it show up on their, inbox.
Yeah. You know, funny story. I don't remember the year. I think it was 2015, but I'm not positive on that. But I had a gentleman come in December and needed to have a crown done. And he was going somewhere for like 3 months. And when we diagnosed the crown, I think we saw him probably a week or two after that when we actually did the prep. And I called my local lab and I was like, hey, can you rush this? Can you get it back to me in like 4 days or something like that? I said, I know I'm asking a lot. And they were like, no, honestly, we can't. So I called another lab in the Kansas City area. I wanted to keep it local if I could. And this is a huge lab. And they said, yeah, for a rush fee, we can get that for you. And I was like, okay, great. So I told the patient it's not the lab I normally use. Um, but they've been around for a long time and they're big, so they got to be successful. So I'm going to have them do it. And he was like, okay. We get the crown back. This is before I was milling. And we get the crown back, and I opened the box, and the model was 3D printed. And I was like, oh, that's how they did that.
Right,
Because
right,
I
right,
had no idea. I figured somebody just, worked around the clock
right,
on
right,
it.
right, right. Yeah, yeah.
But it was just like that. And that's the other part of it. I think sometimes is people don't realize even if you like analog and you send analog, the lab scans it and makes it digital.
Exactly. Right.
And
Yeah,
it's just
yeah. In today's world, yeah, there's no doubt.
yeah. So just sending it digital to start with. I mean, the last stats I saw said that between 40 and 50% of the offices are scanning now. And
Yep.
I can't understand. Financially, fine. If you're strapped, I totally get that. But if it's in your budget, I just can't understand why you wouldn't have a scanner anymore. I mean, it's
Yeah, and I mean, the quality of the scanners now are
Mhm.
so good. And you think of and I had this conversation, with dentists that are learning extra, at extra levels, and it's
Yeah.
like, every layer that you add to a step,
Mhm.
especially if you're, since we're on digital, we're talking about analog and digital.
Right.
If I take an analog impression, I pour it up, I scan it digitally, I design it on the computer, but then I carry it back to the analog world. I'm layering potential
Yes.
problems, right? Like I'm introducing variables that could be
Yes.
right or may not be right. And so I always say the best articulator is the patient, right? Their joints
Yes.
and their anterior stop or whatever
Yeah.
stop we're creating, to me, that is the best articulator, right? And so if I can duplicate that to the best of my abilities, which with me is a scan,
Mhm.
then I feel I'm going to be one step closer. If I have to take a face bow, which, we preach still, but at the same time, um, I have to then make sure that's properly aligned. I now have to take a good bite record. I have to make sure my model fits into that bite record and all those steps that, hey, if I just scan at the bite I want, guess what? I've mounted my lower model right there, so
Yeah.
it
And
just
you're right.
makes sense.
Every step, every step introduces potential errors. I mean, the
Yep.
more
Yep.
variables, the more things can vary. Um, so you mentioned you teach and you teach people about this whole variable thing. Um, Tell me a little bit about your teaching career. We're going to segue into digital dentures here in
Sure.
just a
Sure.
second.
Yeah.
I knows, but I just kind of tell me how you got into that and what you're doing now with that, because I think that's
But
fascinating.
yeah, I mean, it all started, I think, I had parents that were teachers. So, I kind of,
You wanted to be a teacher
grew,
at one.
grew up, yeah, at one point wanted to be a teacher and got into dentistry. And when I moved back to the States to practice, I actually started teaching again at the dental school a little bit, and then, hey, life gets involved and you
Sure.
get into real life and, obviously, teaching doesn't pay as well as dentistry, or at least it shouldn't, or
Right. Yeah.
should, I guess, however we phrase that. And, as I progressed in my career, I knew that, I still like that aspect of helping. And, I always feel that every time I present something, I learn something. And so
Yeah.
it's kind of a driving force for me to keep learning. And, I want to present appropriate information, correct information, uh, current information. And so it keeps me on top of learning and reading and those kind of things. And so as I went through the Dawson Academy, I was fortunate enough to meet some really smart people and get involved with their concepts and started out in that level. And then that kind of got me, I always loved lab work. So for me, like, hey, mounting cases and waxing cases and, same thing, in dental school, we did a lot of waxing at Temple. And so it was a way to make some more beer money. I would set teeth and wax and all day long, and so, um, and then now with digital, I've been fortunate enough to get together with some groups that have allowed me to keep teaching, and especially doing just digital, which is ultimately what I love. And I truly believe in the concepts. And I think, once you get through those first couple cases of committing to the 100% digital world, you realize like, hey, they work, and I don't always have to have this three-dimensional articulator staring at my
Right.
on my desk to kind of walk into a full mouth case, an anterior case, a single unit case, an implant case, with denture case, whatever, and know that I'm going to be in the right spot. And
Mhm.
ultimately, hey, correct data or good data going in is going to give you better
Right.
data coming out. Whether that's an analog impression or a digital impression, the same rules apply, and so there are principles from the analog world that we still need to keep. But yeah, so I love teaching, and any opportunity I can to help people, I do. And so, I try to squeeze that into my schedule as much as possible, which sometimes gets a little bit hard, but, I thoroughly enjoy it.
Well, I I've always I've always loved teaching, and the pressure sometimes of, you mentioned, like good information, current information, correct information. Um, for those that don't do what you and I do, the pressure, at least I feel it, to be like, okay, it's got to be current. It's got to be absolutely spot on correct. You're not flying by the seat of your pants while you're doing that. Um, there's a lot of stress involved in that. So, I mean, I'm glad you're doing it, because obviously you need to. I just want everybody to know that it's not all unicorns and rainbows when
Oh yeah, no,
in front of an audience.
I did a webinar last night actually, and it was an hour long webinar. And it was on digital dentures. But the you don't just sit down and talk for an hour. There's a
Right,
lot of time that goes into, getting enough slides and getting your photos and getting the right data, the right, all that
right.
stuff that goes
Yeah,
in. You spend a lot of time on the background that um, you know to, like I said, to, you want to be as accurate as you can and as up to date as possible. And so it's always evolving, especially in the digital world, and, we're going to talk about 3D printing here in a little bit.
Yes.
What we used 5 years ago is so obsolete compared to now
Yeah.
and a lot of things that, um, if you're still talking about those things, you're, not even close to being on task, and so yeah, so it's something that's always changing.
You said, and I thought it was great because I've heard it from a lot of smart people before. The best articulator ever invented is the human mouth. And it's so true. There's so many schools of thought on, occlusion and jaw relationships and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think that anybody that uses those would say, oh yeah, every time I do this, it works. There's always something. And one of the things that I think is cool about printing and the whole 3D fabrication thing is that if you miss it, if you've got something, that you can adjust, if you can leave somebody in temporaries that look good, last long, are resilient and will hold up, you can take your time with a case and let somebody wear something and make absolutely sure that what they've got is going to work, or alter that and simply scan that altered result and then create that. uh,
Yeah, 1,000%.
yeah, being
Yeah, I
able
mean
to
that's in
reproduce
our
that.
yeah, I mean in our dentate world,
Yes.
I spend a lot of time talking dentures, but we our whole concept is through provisionals, right? Like all of our
Yes.
restorations, we want to know they work, both aesthetically, functionally, structurally,
Yes.
before we get to ceramics. And, like I said, it's much easier to adjust plastic of whatever form, printed,
Yeah.
whatever, versus not. And we actually transitioned about 2 years ago. Every provisional we make is 100% printed, um, single teeth, full arch teeth, anterior teeth, everything. And because it's a template for our final. And most importantly, what I realized, that was my original concept. But at deliveries and a really good provisional made analog, you're relining margins, you're polishing those margins.
Right.
And even with best intentions, whether the dentist does it, the assistant does it, the whatever,
Okay.
those gingival margins sometimes aren't perfect. And you take
Yes.
your temporary off and there's a little bit of bleeding. Well, especially if you're bonding, even traditional cementing, we don't want that. But it's just a game killer time wise. Your efficiency goes out the window. And so I found that if we spend that little extra time and we do use AI to help us for our provisionals, when we take our delivery now, we take those temporaries off, that tissue is so healthy that it's just made our deliveries that much better. And we take our AI design, tinker with it a little bit, right? That's our favorite word
Mhm.
today.
Oh yeah, it is.
And so any adjustments that we make, we translate to our final restoration. So we have almost zero adjustments now because we've already had a trial run of our crown that's been in the mouth.
Yes.
And so great tissue health, contacts are great, interproximally and occlusally. It's just a matter of cleaning the teeth, verifying those contacts, and cementing the restoration. And so it's just, even though it sounds a little more time consuming, we're using technology every day to make our life easier. And obviously, for bigger cases, it becomes much more important to do that. In the denture world, now our triumphs, those are their take home dentures, right? Like they get to wear those things. They're no longer, looking at a mirror for 2 minutes and we're hoping they like them. They get to go home with them and they can eat and drink and talk and chew and do all those things because they're a permanent material, right? They're printed, they
Yes.
look good, they fit good. And it helps us know because if they don't fit well, guess what? Their permanent one's not going to fit well, right? So it builds in all of that success, that plan B,
Yeah.
backup plan type thing. So yeah, it's just the way to do it.
Okay, so perfect segue. Some people love dentures. Some people would rather walk barefoot on hot asphalt than ever do a denture again. Um, when you were in school, you talked about, waxing dentures for people. And oh, by the way, real quick, I'm just going to hold this up. the best tool ever invented in the history of man is the #7 wax spatula. I don't
Yeah.
care. This will do anything. It's a
Cures all. Yeah.
screwdriver. It's a scraper. I'm telling you, I have one in my car. I have, this is no joke. I probably have like 30 of these. They're everywhere. There's one hanging on a magnet on my fridge. Um, but so you obviously enjoy dentures.
Right.
And I know you're not going to do a 1 hour webinar right now about how to
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
it, but as much as you can, kind of describe your denture process to me so that,
Sure.
slides folks can understand it, because
Yeah. Well,
I know you've got great info on this.
yeah. Well, I mean, first and foremost, just because we can do something digitally doesn't mean we push a button and it happens, right? We still have to have a good understanding of anatomy. We still have to have a good understanding of aesthetics, like where do the teeth belong?
Right.
Where does occlusion go? All those things. Let's assume those are part of our understanding. The benefit of digital dentures is I can now take all of those same analog steps, but start to combine them into multiple, all those multiple pieces into one step. And
Mm-hmm.
so I can get my final impression, I can get my jaw relationship, I can get my vertical dimension all in one scan or one group of scans, one order of scans that used to take me 4 visits to get, right? Primary
Yes.
impressions, final impressions, wax rim, bite registration. So I can combine all that. So there's my one visit. My next visit is a try-in, and then I can go to delivery. If everything was lined up appropriately, that's how streamlined digital dentures can be. With the Dawson Academy, we're going to throw in there a good exam, no matter whether they have teeth or
Right.
not, because that's going to give you the understanding of challenges, right? Like, not everybody has great ridges. Not everybody has good
Right.
saliva. Some people have good tongue position. Some people don't. All those things that are still important, not just what we're creating, but having a patient have good expectations of our results before we start is going to make everybody happier and more successful. Um, so office visits are simplified. Um, the fit of digital dentures, whether they're milled or printed, is, you know, research has shown they fit better, and so if I can provide a better fitting prosthetic, checkbox is going to be more successful, right? There's going to be less post-operative treatment for that patient, right? If it fits well, we're not going to be haphazardly grinding on borders like, why is this
Yes.
overextended? What about sore spots? All those things. We have all that decided before we get to our final denture, so we know where we're headed before we get there. Um, the take-home try-in, the wearable try-in, whatever we
Right.
want to call it, is a game changer as well. Because, how many times have we put a try-in in somebody's mouth and we hope they like it because we just want to be done with this process, and they think they like it, and then they come back and their wife hates it, or their daughter is
Mm-hmm.
like, well, that's not my dad. You made him look
Yeah.
different or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like, we can get through all that before we get to the final restoration. So there's much less remakes and extra try-ins and all those kind of things. Um, and we're finally at a point where the digital materials are, if not at least the same strength, but
Mm-hmm.
stronger than what we used to use. Our gold standard in the analog world was IVO-based, injection type
Yes.
products. And a handful of the newer resins are actually stronger than that, not just a little bit stronger, but a lot stronger. So if we have a better fitting material, we have or a technique, and we have something that's just as strong, those now provide great outcomes for our patients, so less visits, potentially cost effective. Most labs aren't going to lower their fees. They're going to say, hey, that comes with the technology that we
Right.
got to do this.
Yeah.
So, but it is more efficient, it is more cost effective. And from a dentist perspective, hey, the less time a patient's in our chair, the more potential profitability we have, especially a procedure that typically is shoved way to the bottom of our schedule. We don't want
Right.
to see them, so we kind of put them off to the side. We don't spend a lot of time because we know if we do, we're going to lose money on it, right?
Yeah.
So, and if we count all those post-operative visits that we used to do, we definitely lose money on it, and
Yeah.
so streamlining the system, having a better fitting prosthetic are keys to actually making a little money on dentures, in most dental
Okay.
practices.
So how do you capture the tissue surface on that initial
So,
visit?
so,
After the exam, obviously.
yeah. So, you basically have two choices, right? You can intraoral scan
Mhm.
edentulous arches, which if anybody's tried, it's a challenging task. And I think even the best intraoral scanners out there of edentulous arches, there's still some gray area of where that border is.
Mhm.
And from the lab side, decent lab techs can get it pretty dialed in, but it's still, I think that's the biggest variability in using intraoral scans as your final impression. For immediate dentures, it's a home run. If somebody shows up with no teeth at all, which is a very small percent of the population,
Right.
but it can happen, and I'm going to make a wax rim, I think that's an easy decision because I prefer to either use a copy denture or a wax rim as my custom tray, right? So
Okay. Yeah.
I'm going to take a final analog impression. It's the only analog step that I prefer to do in
Right.
this process. But with good patient border molding, I'm going to get, I feel, the most accurate border possible through good border molding.
Hmm.
Very rare cases, we'll still do a functional impression somewhere
Right.
in there with hydrocast, which they don't make. Flowcast is what it is now.
Right.
Um, but
Love that
that's
stuff.
but that's thankfully digital dentures fit better. We've kind of eliminated that from our workflow, except in those extremely challenging cases.
Right.
But we know that up front, right? It's not a that plan B. We already know that, hey, because of your you have no ridge. A, B, C, D, E, whatever is there, this may be one more step in our process to get it the best fitting possible. But I prefer to use the copy denture or a wax rim as our final impression,
Okay.
and that's what gives us our tissue.
It's funny you mentioned hydrocast because one of the things that in the old days I used to do was, and some people would probably argue that this is foolish, but I would actually take the wax try-in, put hydrocast in it, tell the patient, you can take this home, you cannot eat, you cannot drink, you cannot drop, but bring it back tomorrow. And at least I knew that they would fit and they were going to stay good. And if they wore it for a while, I'd probably get a better functional impression. But it was a roll of the dice as, is the patient going to do something that they're not thinking about? Like, oh, I've held my car keys in my mouth and these two, I had that
Right,
happen
followed
once.
out, yeah.
Um, but yeah, having the trial denture, like you said, letting them go home, wear this for a day, wear it for, 3 days.
Yeah,
You know,
and honestly, we factor that in as a interim denture because
yeah,
that becomes their backup denture at the very end, right? They have an automatic built-in second denture through this process.
that's genius.
So, and aesthetically, it's a monoblock, but we paint pink on it, so it
Mhm.
looks, aesthetically acceptable.
Right.
It's made out of denture material, so it has the same strengths as the final denture. So it's just a home run in the process. The challenge of print resins is a lot of reline materials don't stick well.
Hmm.
And that's changing, thankfully. Some of the newer products coming out adhere a lot better to some of our reline materials. And
Yes.
so we have to be a little bit concerned. The challenge is when we send stuff to the lab, we don't always know what products they're using. Like
Right.
in the Crown and Bridge world, we can say Emax, right? But did we
Mhm.
get amber? Did we get, was it lithium silicate, lithium
Yes.
disilicate, or whatever? When we old days of PFMs, did we specify what kind of porcelain there were?
Yeah.
We most of the time we didn't. We just got back a restoration.
Right.
Well, especially with digital dentures, it pays to know what materials they're using because everyone is still could be drastically different at this
Right.
stage of the game. And so um, depending on what we're doing, I think that's a critical piece of the puzzle. One of the cool parts of looking at behind you, having the Rodin product there,
Yeah.
their soft reline material is one of the first reline materials out there that adheres acceptably, I would call it,
Hmm.
to printed materials. And thankfully, that product also works with PMMA and some other acrylics and stuff. So it's kind of
Yes.
a cool product that still very technique sensitive, but does work pretty well in the digital denture game for us to get through the healing phase with some relines and stuff like that.
Not to put you on the spot, but it's
Yeah,
probably to put you on the spot. Can you tell me a couple of the base and teeth resins that you like or use?
yeah,
Like, this
sure.
is not an endorsement. I mean, it's just,
Yeah, no,
what
no, no. I mean, I think 2022 was probably the game changer in having resins that were finally strong enough to
Mhm.
say, I can use this as a final restoration. And we're talking in the printing world because milling, we could take pucks of traditional Lucitone
Yes.
or I have a base, whatever,
Right.
PMMA. But in the print world, Dentsply's Lucitone digital print was, I would
Mhm.
say, the first one that was aesthetic enough, strong enough to compete with milled or conventional dentures. And not to say any one of these is perfect, the Rodin products, I think, from a strength standpoint, are really good. Aesthetically, their teeth, I think, are really good. I think the um, the two big factors we look at are strength of the base and wear of the teeth. For me,
Yes.
those are kind of the categories that let me decide should I use a product or not.
Mhm.
Um, and then third would be repairability and bondability to relines down the road. And so the Dentsply material, the Rodin material, and Ivoclar has a base material
Mhm.
that they don't make the teeth, but they make the base. And that one's probably the best for relines, functional
Okay.
impressions, those kind of things. It tends to be the closest to acrylic
Okay.
than where versus a lot of the
Great to
others
know.
are more on the resin side. Um, Asiga's denture base material is another
Mhm.
one we've been playing with a little bit that kind of is giving a run for the money. The challenge with materials, as like most of us know with everything in dentistry, 6 months from now it could be a totally different material.
Yes. Yeah.
And we consistency of product I think is a key factor in choosing materials. Obviously we've got to talk, cost goes into that a little bit,
Mhm.
but thankfully, each category of resins kind of fall into the same price range for the most part. If I'm going to do a high ceramic filled resin, um, between manufacturers, they're all pretty similar. If
Yes.
I'm going to do a denture base, they're all pretty similar. So cost isn't as much of a driving factor nowadays as it was originally.
Well, I actually saw some internal data that I can't say where I got it because I promised people I wouldn't.
Yeah.
But they had some internal data from 3D printing resins, and they factored in everything that people were printing. They factored in um, models if you're printing models, but they also factored in denture base material, denture teeth, surgical guides, all of that stuff. And what they came up with was that the average cost, obviously, if you're talking about like a 3D printed temporary crown, that's a lot less money. But they said the average cost was about $8.50 of resin per print. And like I said, that encompasses a large,
Right, right.
variance, but still $8.50 when you're talking about overhead is, in the world of dentistry, you can sneeze and spend 20 bucks,
Easily, yeah.
Yeah,
Usually at 60,
yeah,
yeah. um,
yeah. It's a good point.
yeah, and so yeah, no, I mean, you look at a denture, even with higher end products, it's still probably less than $40 to get a set of teeth and a
Mhm.
base, and all the stuff to put it together. Maybe you can argue it's 48 on some, 28 on
Right.
others, whatever. But no, it is a very cost effective material to create. And true, we briefly talked about, well, you got to have a printer, you got to have software, you
Mhm.
got to have all those things, or the lab
Right.
has to have all that. So, that's why they justify their fees. And just like we justify our fees as a
Sure.
dentist, um, same thing, the education, all that stuff goes into that number. But yeah, totally. From a material cost, printing is a significantly more cost-effective process, and even more than milling, just because there's not as much waste, whether you're milling a little block or you're milling out of a disc, you know, one of my lab techs, she high fives me when we can get 25 teeth on a disc, on
It's the
average.
Tetris game of milling. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
just
Right.
did
Like
this.
how,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm high fiving her because, hey, that's a huge, chunk. But,
Yeah.
but still, if you're still, there's a lot of waste in
Hmm.
reductive manufacturing versus
Yes.
printing. And not that there isn't waste in printing, but it's still much less, and the
Yeah.
resins are cheaper overall versus milling.
So let me ask you a question. You do a lot of dentures, and honestly, I don't know they've ever asked anybody this before, but maybe you can tell me. When we were doing acrylic, occasionally, I mean, it didn't happen much, but a patient would come in, one tooth would have popped out of the base. Um, and I don't know why, but the dental fates are such that it was always a tooth in the aesthetic zone. So it
Yeah,
was always
obviously.
critical.
Yeah, yeah.
Now that we're printing, and you're printing obviously an arch of teeth that then's bonded in to, an arch of base, do you see much single tooth fracture like that anymore?
I would say no. One, I because of the chemical bond, we're
Mhm.
having very similar products, both, tooth and base still chemically being very similar,
Right.
with some differences, obviously. The whatever material that we're using to bond those teeth together, every manufacturer has their own whatever version
Oh,
of,
yeah.
of
Yeah.
bonding. But I feel that connection is significantly less. Hey, have printed and milled dentures broken? Yes, absolutely. No different than a conventional denture.
Yep.
Most of the time, we see the whole tooth shear off. It's still attached to the base. It's just
Okay.
a third of that tooth fractured off or something like that. And even then, honestly, we didn't have a whole lot of that in conventional dentures either. But when
Mhm.
it did happen, I think it's less now. From a repairability standpoint, in when we first started talking about printed dentures, and if we had to do a reline, it was almost more cost effective just to take a wash impression and print the new denture than it was to
Make a
go
new one.
through the labor involved of
Mhm.
doing a repair took longer than reprinting a denture, right? Especially if we weren't making any changes.
Sure.
Say somebody had a denture and the dog ate it,
Yeah.
um, and it was 6 months old or a year old or 2 days old or whatever. Um, to go through the process of gluing that back together, relining it, starting all over, it was easier, faster just to reprint it,
Sure.
and even if we did a reline, it was still like, wow, for the hour and a half steps to analog do this repair
Right.
or scan it, reprint it. It was just faster to do that. But theoretically, you could just like we would, say the tooth broke and it went down the drain or they swallowed it, you would just
Yeah.
grind it out and put a denture tooth in. And the same. It's chemically close enough that you can bond to the newer materials, so you could repair it the same way.
Yeah. No, I was curious about that because obviously, and like I said, I never asked anybody that before, and I probably should have, but just because you're printing an arch of teeth and those teeth are connected to each other, I figured between that and the bond, they would reinforce each other better.
Yeah, yeah. I
Single
mean,
piece set into
yeah.
acrylic, but I wasn't sure.
Theoretically, it's turning into a monoblock.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I'm sure there's some weak link in that bond,
Mhm.
because it's not 100%, and
Right.
kudos to the milled side. Like Ivoclar has their Ivotion disc where it's the pink and the white fused together, so it's one block.
Yes. It's amazing.
Great technology. All the cases we've done with that, and you can manipulate it software wise where you want
Mhm.
the pink and white. There's always some place that's not accurate, but in general, it's a great solution. But yeah, I feel that with 3D printed dentures, with good technique, it's as close to a mono block as possible. So you don't really see a separation between tooth and base.
Right.
You can
Okay.
see a fracture somewhere, but I haven't seen that whole tooth pop out.
Right. So a little change in subject. Once again, this is not an endorsement. I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
kind of want to know, what 3D printers do you use in your office?
So we
I know you've
have
got more than one.
yeah, we have three. We have two Asiga printers, which
Okay.
are my favorites. I mean, if I had to tell somebody this is the printer you should get,
Mhm.
um, and that's just my opinion,
Yeah,
but it's based on accuracy, speed, all those things, tech support, you name it. Like
right,
they, my first one I got in 2018, kind of at the early stages of the printing
right.
revolution, and it still works as good as my newer ones. I do have a Sprint Ray because at the time I was making that change to printing provisionals,
Hmm.
and they were the first one that had a smaller kind of build platform,
Hmm.
which allows things to be printed faster. And so to just speed up our workflow,
Yeah,
probably wasn't a good ROI to spend 10 grand on a printer to print provisionals, but
right,
for me, that was the way I wanted to practice. And so at the time, that was the solution because I can now print provisionals in 10
right,
minutes, instead of waiting 25 minutes and for single teeth or arches of teeth, doesn't matter, it's all vertical height.
right.
Um, Nowadays, the Asiga has a same smaller build tray. And so I'm kind of going back to using
Hmm.
that for our provisionals just because I have a little bit more range of materials now versus,
Yeah,
some manufacturers you're limited to their,
yeah.
small selection of
Closed
third party.
systems.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right, right.
you have to use
So,
it. Yeah.
so I feel that, those are the two brands I have. Obviously, Sprint Ray, marketing champions of the world right
Oh my
now.
gosh,
Yeah, they
yes.
they 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 are just the king of marketing. Um, I don't want to say anything negative about any other scanners. I feel that, or printers, sorry, um, they do an acceptable job, but if I had to print everything all day long, it would be on my Asiga, and not
That's
that
gonna.
Frozen's, there's some other ones out there that are good, but I
Yeah,
think, I think you look at speed and accuracy as your driving force. And then
yeah,
lastly, open material platform, right? I want to be able to print, I love materials. So if a new one comes out, I'm going to try it, and because I want to know, is this good or not? Can
yeah.
I break it? Can I not? Those kind of things.
Uh, one of my printers is in a Sega, and I will back up what you said about just quality and ease of use. But there are a lot of good ones out there.
Totally.
Um,
Yep.
but the I think, and this may go back to the fact that you and I are tinkerers. But yeah, the one thing when I buy any technology that mills could apply to this too, because there may be different materials coming out that you want to try. I kind of hate locked being into just one platform because
Absolutely.
something comes out, I'm like, hey, I want to try that, even if I'm just trying it on the bench. Let's
Yep.
just put this on this model and see how it fits, whatever, to tinker. Um, I just love being able to do that new stuff, and I get to play
Yeah, and
with it.
that's the beauty of
So,
digital, yeah, of not only, the manufacturing side, but the design
right.
side, right? Having the flexibility to be like, hey, can I design this reduction guide and print it?
Yeah,
Can I do, this crazy, ortho splint or some kind of
right.
other whatever, like, hey, if we can think it, we can do it.
Yeah,
The other day a dentist was like, hey, can you, if you take a look at like some of those sleep appliances where you have, two flat planes put together in occlusion, like, can you do that? And I was like, I don't know. I haven't tried, And so we
yeah,
played around a little bit and we got it. I was like, what benefit that is? That's not a sleep appliance. I don't really know, but hey, we
yeah.
have we have something we can try. So yeah, so the flexibility to do so many things is now in front of us that and especially when you've already committed to the technology, you have the product, that sky's the limit, right? And open platform is key. You need to be able to get whatever data you want in to
Hmm.
generate any type of material, any type of product you want to put out. If you're limited, then I would say that may not be the right piece of equipment.
I am like a marketing person's dream because I have always, it doesn't matter in the old days if I was buying a new sound system or whatever, it's like I want options. I don't want just, side to side balance. I want to be able to, tinker and twist and turn on sound. And I've always felt like whenever I bought something and I talked myself out of buying the best one and I went with the middle, eventually I tell myself, why didn't I just bite the bullet and
Exactly.
buy, the one with all the options? Because
Yeah.
here I am now wishing I could, or
Yeah.
whatever. Um, so when are your next courses, Charlie?
So I have a denture course at the Dawson Academy,
Yeah.
October 23rd through the 25th. Um, and then we just have some small stuff going on with
Okay.
John Cranham and his
Yeah.
group here and there. So, but yeah, that's kind of the big one coming up in October.
And they can go to Dawson Academy to sign up. Is
Yep,
that
yep,
right?
yep,
Okay.
yep, yep.
Cool.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
Well,
So
my
it's
friend,
all on dentures.
we're we're bumping up against our time limit. So
Totally, absolutely.
I
So it was
wish I
great.
wish we
Had a
didn't
great
have a
time.
time limit. Yeah, thank you very much. I'd love to have you back sometime and talk some more. This has been really fascinating. Thank you for putting up with me and answering some of
No,
the
no, always
questions
thank
about
you. Yeah, no,
dentures
I
breaking
always
us through.
appreciate it.
All
Absolutely.
right,
So have a great
everybody.
weekend.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is the Technology Evangelist Podcast. I'm Dr. John Fluke. We are sponsored by Medidenta Digital, and we will talk again soon. Thank you.